This one, it's a brand new training and very much was something that was built out while I was over in Europe. I think for us, we do so many things for our clients. I'm going to kind of look at this through a couple of different lenses. And if you're on a couple of our trainings before, if you've gone through our podcasts, we really go through sort of a physical, digestive, and psychological lens. And within that, that's a 10-year degree in every direction, right? Like there's a lot to really unpack to look at operating at your highest level and making sure that your body's really working. But today, I think we're going to go very much more from your approach to health as a whole, which is kind of a bigger topic. But I think it's really just a reflective space of if you do feel that you're battling yourself a little bit with health and business, I do want to make sure that this becomes more of a partnership rather than a constant conflict and see what we can sort of manage. All right. So the approach with this really overall is, I work with a lot of men and women in the space of they're really starting to create a really strong, stable business for themselves. And they're starting to realize that success is beyond simply the monetary amount coming through from business, but actually getting to a point where they're building back that joy muscle. They're building back that ability to actually feel like they can switch off. And I think the phrase that we've really come to use a lot now is the person that can afford the beach house is the one that usually doesn't enjoy it. And I think that's one that we see too often where there's really a muscle that has been built and there's also a muscle that has atrophied. And I think we just want to make sure we can build that out or balance that out a bit more. All right. So a couple of you know me, some of you don't. I'll keep this super short, but basically for the last decade or even more now, I've been very much specializing with entrepreneurs and business owners to get health back in their lives. I've got a huge respect for anyone that builds their own company, really builds their own project in any way. But a lot of time, if you've been doing that for more than 3 to 5 years, there's a level of personal energy management that really comes to the surface is usually a bit of a problem, right? And looking at creating a bit more of a integration where health is hopefully an asset for how you feel on your day-to-day basis rather than a liability that you're constantly trying to keep on top of, that's where we really come in, all right? So my general summary of really the last decade has been massive obsession around exercise, really making sure that you know how to contract a bicep properly, then realizing that I'm looking at 3% of the entire picture, looking at this through more an inflammatory piece, through the gut health, this digestive aspect, which is incredibly interesting in its own right. And then thirdly, where I'm at now is very much what we call the shift, but it's really that awareness of behavioral design, getting you to move towards health in a compassionate way, in a one that's going to sustain long term. And certainly if you're beyond sort of 30, 35, you're in your mid 40s, 50s, you're probably quite aware now that things aren't working like they used to, right? And that's a space where sometimes you start, hopefully, paying attention to what's actually going on, right? So that's really where I want to spend a bit of time today. Big obsession of mine. I think of this all the time, and I think really just allows you to consolidate, hopefully, where I'm coming from, all right? So overall, I guess first point I'll bring up, if anyone's watched one of my podcasts, you're probably always double checking if you're watching these things on 2x speed. I do talk fast. I don't apologize for that, but I will make sure that if there's anything you want to ask in the chat, I'm happy to just tangent off wherever. If you need me to pause Nadia or anything else, if you've got questions, I can slow down as well. All right. So the 4 kind of bits I want to go through today is really the goalpost has moved. I think the big part here is if you're running a business and trying to keep your health on track, the motivation and driver towards keeping this as a front of mind activity needs to be a conversation we have. Maybe I can do a bit of a reframe for you. Second part to this is reactivity, as you know, in a business space is really the killer of productivity, but it really gets in the way of a lot of things when it comes to health and probably things that you're not aware of that I want to dive a little bit deeper into. The third one, it becomes a really powerful spot that Lou, I'm sure you're very aware of in the physio space and awareness of how much your body is just that sieve to your emotions, your reactions, your state to the outside world. And I think bringing it back to that's going to be really, really fun. And then lastly, it wouldn't be a business talk if we didn't really start to bring this back to the strategies you're putting in place with this amazing company. I do want to make sure that, this wealth strategy you're putting in place, at the end of the day, you need a vehicle to enjoy it. All right. So I want to make sure that we bring this back to being strong, healthy, and in a position that, a big part of wealth accumulation is the time to allow it to come to fruition. Right. And if you're getting to the point that you're in your mid 50s or 60s and you're really not in a position to enjoy it, then I think you've missed the boat a little bit. All right. So I do want to make sure that we keep that as part of the bigger picture. All right, so I think the biggest frustration, hopefully I'm on track with this one so far, but the frustration that we tend to see come through a ton here is that we're trying to keep our health in check, but we keep getting sidetracked, right? We've got these projects, we've got these clients to deal with, we've got certain parts of the business that take up a fair amount of our focus, not to mention family life and everything else going on at home as well. A lot of the time there's that nagging feeling in the back of our head where we feel like we're self-sabotaging, we don't know why we find it so hard, or we feel like the world or our business is kind of working against us a little bit. It's just a little bit hard to keep on top of our personal health. A lot of the time, I think we start to become very aware of how it's getting harder to stay in shape as we get older, and the body's just not responding like it used to, right? So the getting a couple more workouts in or missing a couple beers on the weekend, that little bit of extra effort that used to do the job's really just not doing the same thing anymore. I think the big part of this, and you're going to see this perspective from me hopefully a little bit throughout today, is that ability to zoom out and really look at it from a 10-foot view. I find is incredibly helpful when we look at the space that is ultimately the reactivity that we fall into inside of a business space day to day. All right, I'm sure all of you have seen a version of this chart or diagram in the past, and I think it's a big part of building out a bit of a health plan, a bit of a strategy towards a wealth plan as well, is we get so stuck in the urgent important stuff day to day that when we look at the things that we know are important, will move our business, move our life forward, but they're not urgent, they constantly keep getting put on the back burner. All right, so it's usually health falls into that category, right? It's something that we know is important, but it's something that we tend to see gets pushed when the next meeting or something urgent comes through. And I think when you're in your first year or two of business, that's something that it's a shift in priorities, that there's a level of push that comes through. But if you're 3, 5, 10 years plus into business, that reactivity space is something that you know gets in the way of you really actually moving the needle, you being able to feel like you can move forward. And it's exactly the same in health. It's something that really for us, we want to make sure that we can block out that time in a way that allows us to be okay with a level of white space in our calendar. Sometimes it's just giving us permission to go to the gym at 3 p.m. or go for a walk at lunchtime if others are working. And I think certainly for business owners, that mental chatter is a common one we hear, is even if we do actually have the space to go for a walk or go watch our kids' soccer game, doing that at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday just feels wrong because we feel like we should be working, right? And I think a lot of that is a muscle that has been built over time, which I want that to be beneficial. I want that to be actually hopeful, because it is something that if it's being built, we can also build that joy muscle. We can build that muscle of actually building things back into balance a wee bit. So I want to go a little bit deeper as well. Hopefully that resonates with you initially with, it kind of feels like I actually now, if I'm really honest with myself, I do have time, but getting a way of building that back in a bit of a strategy. I think one of the things that I've seen a ton, certainly as if we're getting more clients into, their 40s and 50s, if you're starting to reach that space where your body's, not feeling like a spring chicken anymore, made of rubber and magic, we want to get to a point where sometimes that motivation shifts a little bit, right? Health starts to feel a bit vague. It's no longer about the six-pack abs and it may still be part of it. There's absolutely still a vanity aspect that 100% you still want to look good naked. But that awareness of, I think there's a hesitancy towards a lot of diet plans now because it's super off-putting. It tends to be very focused on fat loss at all costs. And as a business owner, when you've got so much on your plate, you realize that, hang on, I need to make sure that I've got energy, I've got focus. I'm not pissed off because I haven't had carbs today to talk to people around me. And I think that starts to become a real put off to get towards a lot of these plans, right? Certainly as business owners, those demands are super high, not just on our demands of our time and our energy, but very much on our health as well. And we need to make sure that we find hopefully a balance between those two. So something that Peter Attia says very well is, I think the world is full of a lot of tactics to improve your health, this awareness of what can we do in 30 days. What I'd love to do today is very much just focus on the bird's eye view of strategy, right? How are we making sure directionally we're right? And I think for you that allows a fair amount of hopefully permission to tweak, adjust, experiment, and see what this looks like, knowing that overall you're directionally right, you're allowed to stuff up along the way. And I think that's a huge part of health, is we come from a place of that all or nothing mentality that doesn't particularly serve us very well when it comes to health itself. All right. So that's a bit of context, team. I think hopefully that's where I'm coming from overall. The perspective I want to give here, and I'm going to start with a bang. I want to make sure we start with you writing some things down on paper. So if you don't have something to write on, I will have a couple of things I do want to be asking you through the presentation. I should have probably asked you that at the start, but just thought about it now, so that we can really start to get this more solidified for you as an individual. All right. So the perspective I want to put in place here is, what if instead of looking at exercise as your benefit for today's energy and body, we also look at this as a deposit for your 80-year-old self, right? For you guys in the room, that should feel like a pretty common theme, right? You're putting a certain amount, you're allocating a certain amount towards future funds, as well as the growth in today's splurge account. The big part here is when we create a long-term health building system, that strategy I'm talking about, then we start to really understand that 1 hour of exercise, or those adjustments we make in our health, starts to equal those 2 or 3 hours added to our life at 80. So it becomes a deposit worth making. It's kind of like, do you want to spend an hour in the gym now? Or do you want to spend an hour in the hospital later? It's a different conversation. As I mentioned before, it really becomes a strategy of, if we don't make time for our wellness now, we'll be forced to make time for our illness later. And I think it really is a space of that reactivity mindset. I'm certainly not going to force anyone in this room to make changes to their health. All I can simply do is offer a perspective of what one feels more important when you look at it through the right lens. Okay? So the first question I really have for you, and a concept I really enjoy asking people, is we're really optimizing for 80. What does that really look like? What do we want to be able to do? Right? When we get to that point, we start to really realize the deposits that we're making today have a very real impact on how we're feeling at 80. All right? The stats on strength and balance and everything I want to dive into in a second, but what the first question I'm really going to ask here for you is, what do you still actually want to be doing at 80, right? It's probably not going to be the full marathon, but we're going to get an awareness of, when we really break this down, what do we still want to be doing at 80, right? Do we want to be walking the dog? Do we have a big golden retriever 40-kilo dog that we don't really want to get pulled over with? Do we still want to be having sex? Yes, it's possible at 80, the dirty dogs. Do you want to be showering yourself? Do you want to be still working and really using that brain again? Do you want to be picking up grandkids, right? We really want to look at that through, what do we still want to be able to do at 80? I think it's important to look at that, really visualize what that is. I'd love to get a couple of those examples in the chat. We'll keep them PC for today, team, but it'll be good to see what we're still doing at 80. Mick, still running marathons at 80. Awesome. So a big part of that might be the part of that is fitness, right? But a huge part of that is going to be strength, stability of your knees, keeping those glutes going, making sure that you're pulling with muscles, not just smashing joints. It might be a change in running style if you're not moving towards more of a striking with your ball of your foot rather than the heel, right? There's adjustments of how we can keep doing that long term. Cool. All of the above, except work. Come on. Grandkids and your grandkids for sure. Yep. Still working and running. I like that. Playing the orchestra. Really cool. That's Sarah, of course. Maybe half unrealistic. Yeah, well, half is still okay at that age. Still want to be doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Awesome. Moving fast enough to play with kids, pick them up, etc. Still working with some capacity, keeping that brain going, right? What's the one thing that declines mental cognition more than anything? Stopping work. So everyone but Nadia, you got hope. Traveling and doing physical fun stuff. Yep. Brilliant. Cool. So you've got a pretty good idea in mind. I think there's going to be a case of, well, there's a mindset shift that really comes with this, right? Which is, if you're anything past 32, 34, at some point you hit your last PB. At some point you are past your absolute peak. And that in itself creates a huge amount of shifts in, hopefully, how you're thinking, because that motivation to do better than yesterday changes to, how can I make sure I do as well as yesterday? And just trying to maintain these things as long as possible. When you look at that through the 2-week lens, that becomes quite depressing. When you look at that through the optimizing for 80 lens, hopefully that allows you to really build that towards, I still want to be doing cool stuff at 80. I don't want to be, spending that last decade in a wheelchair, right? So making those adjustments through what we can control, of course, I think really allows you to first get an anchor in place. So what we're going to look at here, team, is for what you've written down, right? It's doing the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's doing the half marathon, maybe the full, it's playing your favorite musical instrument or whatever that might be. I'd love to ask, what are 2 things that you're doing currently now to help your 80-year-old self? And then what are 2 things you want to add to help your 80-year-old self? I'd love to know what the second ones are. This is just going to give you 30, 40 seconds, but I'd love to know what are 2 things you'd want to add to help your 80-year-old self. Maybe because it's just a bit of a different lens. 35 and I'm feeling it. Yep. Anything past 30. For males, if you don't know, it's beyond 30, there's very much it tends to be a gradual decline. I think the most obvious one for most men is sort of a 1 to 2% decrease in testosterone beyond 30. And I think when we look at that acceleration compared to even 80 years ago, has been something that we've got like 70% less testosterone than we did in that time frame. Whereas females, we have that happening through more of a 9 or 10 year window, right? Which is our lovely friend menopause, where we start to see that happening in a more drastic decade. But definitely around that 35, 45, we're starting to see that happen. More mobility work and stretching. Great. I'm a huge fan of mobility if I was to choose between mobility and flexibility. The only difference is that mobility is flexibility plus strength. Really, really important part to look at there. More walking, yep. 10,000 steps a day. Less red line sessions. More flexibility sessions. Really, really interesting observation, Michael. Red line sessions, I'm assuming we're looking at sort of like the hit training and pushing ourselves to, that sort of 200 beats per minute. It would be super interesting to know how we continue to train that threshold. The only reason I bring that up is because we see a lot of people trying to move away from, I'm going to start slowing down, I'm going to start doing more walking, more flexibility. Whereas if you want to stay strong for as long as possible, keeping that weight training going, maybe not, the full heart rate through the roof type of stuff, but actually continuing to push that envelope in regards to keeping strength going, it would be one way to keep that, strong as long as possible. Yep, these are all good. There's a lot of movement here, right? There's a lot here that's going to come through nutritionally, hopefully, as well, but being able to build that Pilates as well. Yep. Stand most of the working day. Vitamins and supplements are important. Yep. Certainly on the female side, just as much on the male side, but Sarah knows this, is we, certainly on the female side, we push hard the protein intake. It's one of these things that so many women just start to decrease and decrease as we get older. One of the things that I will mention is what tends to decrease more as you get older is your amount of stomach acid, which means that we tend to struggle with digesting foods more if you don't address it, of course. So we start to reduce the meat intake or the heavier food intake rather than actually addressing the problem, which is typically the ability to digest. So even looking at adding sort of a bit of assistance there to keep that protein intake up can be a really nice way to improve it as well. But really, really good answers here initially, team. So where I want to go with this next is short-term goals really create short-term actions, right? It's this whole concept of finding those hacks, finding those tactics that are trying to get the new quick win. What I want to really look at here is how we start to look at playing the long game here and start stacking the habits in a way that it focuses on how you feel rather than trying to hit it out of the park in 30 days. This is a concept we use a ton, probably one many of you as evolved individuals are aware of, but it's a concept that I bring back to me watching The Last Dance, being the basketball documentary with Michael Jordan. I was the guy that watched the whole series in a couple of days and went out and bought a basketball, and I was like, this is fun, without any actual inclination to be like, I don't want to put in the work to actually be a basketballer, right? And I think that's something that a lot of people do when they see the Olympic medal, they see the Michael Jordan documentary, whatever it might be, where we start to glorify the goal, but we have no actual intention of doing the steps required to get to that point. What I'm saying here is ultimately we're glorifying the outcome rather than trying to really feel more involved in the process. And I think a big part of this is when we set the 30-day goal, we set the next half marathon, we set the arbitrary goal, we do satisfy that chipmunk brain in the next 30 days, but we miss the last step, which is what are the actions that we actually need to fall in love with every day that allow us to feel like we can do this long term, right? The concept we use all the time is, if you can't do it every day, why do it for one? And it's really getting to a mindset, to a space where the actions that I'm putting in today to, for example, lose 5 kilos might be, there might be a tangible result of those 5 kilos, and it gives you something to measure for. But by hydrating more in the morning, by taking time out of lunch to actually get a proper meal in, to get a workout in, how do you then show up better? How are you less reactive around your kids? How are you more focused at work? How do you show up as a better leader? All of those things that allow you to look at, I actually feel much better as a human because of doing the stuff. So I'm going to continue to do it long after that 5 kilos is gone. Otherwise, if I've just focused on the 5 kilos, I'm probably going to drop 5 kilos by stressing out my body in any way possible to get to that 5 kilos. And then I'm going to get to the end of it and probably put 10 on because I've just held my breath through the whole process. So it's really just looking at it through the perspective of what goal are we setting, why are we setting it, and are we actually enjoying it? So this really comes back to this concept that was introduced to me pretty well close to a decade now. One of my first mindfulness coaches and instructors that went through this space and really brought a concept to me that really has stuck with me since, which I hope is helpful. And I think many of us I think everyone has this movie in our head, right? There's an awareness of where we are now and where we think we should be, right? There's always a discrepancy. There's always a gap. Now, we're happy if our life matches this movie, but we're pretty disappointed if we don't. And a lot of that starts to become a process of how we talk to ourselves about that gap. Because if we have it there, it's something that we sort of need to address a little bit more, all right? The big one here is when we're so impatient, that monkey brain really beats ourselves up about why we haven't dropped everything and sorted our shit out already, right? It's a process of, well, we've got a goal right in front of us. Why have we not achieved it? And I think it's really getting an awareness of this gap of what's really happening is an opportunity to change how we look at the world overall, or at least how we look at the goal. And the reason I bring this up, and I do want to keep this incredibly actionable for you, is one, the most resilient people are the ones that are most self-compassionate. I don't think that's talked about enough, is an awareness of if you beat yourself up the whole way to the goal, you're not going to be having a particularly nice time. Health is one of those things that is very much focused on trying to manage your health in an imperfect world. You're not going to knock it out of the park for 6 and everything get better. It's a case of just consistently chipping away and getting slightly better than you did, or chipping away and building on top of what you had. And I think the biggest part of that is that process in itself is quite simple. The hard part of that is how we talk about ourselves along the way. All right, so just want to bring that one up first. As I mentioned before, life punches us in the face. We don't need to as well, right? So just that concept of how we talk to ourselves, that internal dialogue, that compassionate change is something that we need to really look at. And it's a real problem, but it's one that we all understand, all right? What I mean by this is all of us have a personal threshold of when we finally decide to change. Some of us, it might be we've got 5 kilos extra that we need to drop. For some of us, it might be that we've had our first heart attack and we're sitting in a hospital bed, or somewhere in between, right? It's all a personal threshold of how bad would we like it to get before we make a change. But that also means that we're coming to it from a place of pain, that we finally get to a point that we no longer want to tolerate it, that we finally are motivated enough to change. Now, the reason I bring that up is back to our first point, is if we're motivated by pain, as soon as we get out of pain, we are no longer motivated. We fall back in the hole and start again. So the reason I'm going to lean on this compassionate change thing a little bit here, team, is so that if you lose that, if you gain a drive to make a change for you, I want to then see a shift in the dialogue around how we can keep that long term. Otherwise, it does become a process that is quite unenjoyable, right? And I think in itself, it just changes the entire strategy of where we go to next. All right. So the big part I'm trying to get across here, team, is, rather than trying to be perfect every day and beating ourselves up as soon as we miss one thing, right? I had this conversation with someone like 2 days ago, which is I've set a goal for 10 kilos and I've only lost 8. I've completely failed. And it's like, well, you've lost 8 and you feel amazing. Your business is growing. You feel more connected with your wife and everything else you just told me, but you've told me that everything's failed, right? So it's just trying to be perfect and missing the everything in front of you that is improving, and ultimately the habits that you've put in place that you can continue moving forward. So it doesn't really matter about the timeline. You feel amazing because we don't all sit there, as much as we all think we do, sit there with a number on our head of how much we weigh, right? Or how much we've earned, or whatever it might be. It's how we show up and how we conduct ourselves on a day-to-day basis. So I think that space that we're trying to move towards, and if this allows hopefully regardless of what the steps are, right? It could be anything, but it becomes a space of our entire approach, certainly with how we coach clients, is what's the first thing we can put in place? It might be a case of just starting with an initial intake of water. It could be going for a 10-minute walk around the block. Just do that for 2 weeks. Now, as all of you in this room are going to be pushing for more, it's like, yeah, well, that's simple, but what's next? I'm like, just do it for 2 weeks. And just think about how much of a internal conflict that brings up because you thought you needed to do 10 things. Hopefully, that's something that really allows you to highlight how much it's actually an internal chatter that's holding us back from actually achieving things long term, rather than just doing the simple thing in front of us, right? So that's the shift. That's the approach I want to sort of build towards you. It's very much more about the internal chatter than the actual approach in front of us. So the first part of this, self-compassion, I've said that word a couple times first, but I want to look at this through 2 questions we're going to ask you right now before we move into the next step. Does exercise feel like self-care, or does it feel like self-punishment? First question. Second one, how do you speak to yourself when you've fallen off a health routine? When you feel like you're doing well for a little while and then it's not going so well anymore? Let's just get some answers for that first. Once you've got both of those in the chat, team, I just want to see, what am I going to say here? Rather than the second question, which I think we'll change over time, I'd like to just know if it's self-care or self-punishment. That'd be really helpful. So, before we move on to the next one, team, is that second one here is how do you speak to yourself when you've fallen off? I have given you a bit of a pep talk on this one, so hopefully you've written down your actual answer rather than what you'd like it to be. But I would like you to adjust that to what that might look like now, right? How would you talk to your friend if they did the same? If they fell off that routine, how would you talk to them? Okay, so first one here, team. Yeah, what would we say to our friend if they did the same? And then the second one is, how could we change about how we talk to ourselves in these situations? The one, as Sam mentioned as well, right? It could be the temperature outside that changes our internal dialogue. A big one that I would look at here is sometimes if it's an easy workout, you might be okay, but what is it? Pay attention to how you talk to yourself when you get to 10/10ths of exertion, right? Is that an internal chatter that's helpful, or is that one that's like, come on, get on with it? Getting a space where that can be a nudge as your self-supporter or really your worst critic. I think the unfortunate reality is that most people that are standing on those Olympic podiums are probably the first. Cool. So again, hopefully this is probably less of you're getting tons of answers out of this now, but instead something that hopefully sits with you for a couple of days, and you start to, next time you go for a walk, you do a workout, something along those lines, you just see that voice come through, right? And it's maybe a space where there's a dessert that comes through, and you beat yourself up for having it, right? The mental chatter or the guilt about the cookie usually does more damage than the cookie itself. So that awareness of just how we talk to ourselves in that space is a big one. Cool. So the reason I started on this team, why I talked about our approach, our mindset, our mental chatter before we dove into anything else, is a huge part of our program, our strategy, our overall design of how we get people healthy is very much that. We focus on health first rather than just trying to slog yourself in the gym, drop your calories through the floor and get your result in 2 weeks, right? Like it's very much a goal of you actually have to change your mentality first. Otherwise, all of that just sounds like we're going too slow. So the big one is the way, I guess the difference or an analogy for that strategy is most people when it comes to health is they get in the car, they see that the wheel is kind of falling off, but they just push the accelerator a little bit harder. The goal here is, hang on, let's fix the wheel first. Let's make sure that things are actually operating so that when you push, things actually work. All right. And I think certainly men, you're a little bit more inclined to do it this way, but females certainly fall into the same category, just different ways. So appreciating the engine light, being able to check things under the hood a little bit more, make sure that you feel good first. That very much for us, if we look at it through 2 points, are you sleeping well? Are you actually sleeping through a full night? And is your energy solid throughout the day? Are you dipping and diving all over show? If we start with those points first, that allows us to really get things healthy before we look at what we need to do after that. All right. So rather than slogging ourselves in the gym or doing a couple extra bike rides, we really want to address that stress on the body, that gut health, that poor sleep, and really your reactions to the outside world, which come into our regulation of our nervous system overall. All right. If we're not, we start to leave a lot of those results on the table. And this is something that why I bring it back to age so often is because the older we get, the more likely this is something that has been not addressed for a long time and more important as we start to get older, because you just don't get away with it. All right. So just something that we'll start to look at, and why that lens of our mentality around how we approach it and why we approach it that way to start with is where we start. So I mentioned this before. I think it's a big part of the whole process of where we go to from here. The man that can afford the beach house is usually the one that can't enjoy it. The reason I dive into that team is I do need to really address this and hit this home a little bit more around how we actually redefine success overall, because a lot of this up until now, hopefully, one, it's 50% of you this has landed. For the other 50% of you, it's like, yeah, this makes sense, but get on to the actual, the stuff. And I think a big part of it is understanding that if we look at this as a strategy rather than a tactic, this is the stuff. So I want to use this story of Larry Miller first. If you haven't heard of him, he's actually surprisingly unknown unless you're in Utah area. But he is the owner was the owner of the Utah Jazz, the Salt Lake Bees, and like 90 other companies. Like if you lived in that area, it was impossible to not have bought something from one of his stores. Like he just owned everything, from car dealerships to cinemas to everything else going on in this area. So the one thing that really came through here is Larry was one that very much, he built the muscle of work. He was an absolute animal when it came to working all of the time. But what was brought up in this interview and what was brought up in the book, if you ever want to read it, is the sort of underlying tone that started to come through from some of these interviews, which was he acknowledges that he didn't really know any other way to live his life, right? He'd created success really early on, but he continued to push. And even if he was to go back and do it again, knowing that he regretted how he approached it, he knew no other way of doing it, and he'd continue to do 80-hour weeks, right? He just spent so much of his life working that when we ask, if you were to ask the question of how do you find time for joy? When do you spend time with your kids? It's kind of a deer in headlights. And this has all really started from a presentation I did 3 or 4 years ago for a similar group like this. And the one question was, what do you do for joy? And everyone was like, I file my taxes and I go back to work tomorrow, right? Like it's an awareness of like there's something missing there. And I think it's a case of building that muscle overall. So the one thing that really hit me through that interview is when his wife was asked what it was like without him around, she said, it was very sad, but to be honest, he was never really around much when he was alive, right? So this guy was immensely rich, he was obese, and he was full of regrets on his deathbed. He actually had some limbs amputated before he died. And he really had no time with his kids, with his wife, and really didn't know those little joys in life, dying at 64. So it really starts to look at just, you're in the space of building a business, this wealth creation space. I just want to make sure that that pillar of health is on that picture too. And once we look at health, we start to realize how much that ties in that relationship piece as well. All right. The second one I want to bring up real briefly is the owner of, or the founder of IKEA, right? He was, from a business sense, someone you can respect very well, simply from a myopic focus on one task. And from a business and a wealth generation machine, from 1785, that was his life, right? 68 years of building one company and building his personal net worth to over 50 billion. But again, when interviewed about his life and career, one of the things he said is to keep his life as a cautionary tale. One of my biggest regrets is that I sacrificed my relationship with my kids to build IKEA. I missed my kids' childhood. So the reason I bring those two up is just really an awareness towards what you're building, what you're growing, what calls you get on. It's really, really interesting to see how much health is something that's like, yeah, I'm doing that. But it's kind of a back seat, as opposed to how this really becomes a cornerstone and hopefully the bridge between building the company and finding that time for your kids and yourself. And really, it's one of those things that when we put the deposits in today, it makes a really big difference down the line. So as I mentioned before, team, I was in Europe for 6 weeks, just got back a couple weeks ago. And I had this is really kind of where this whole presentation came from. So it hasn't been around a long time. It really became something I dove into a lot while I was over there. Wrote half a novel. And I got to meet my other half's cousin who lives up in north of France. His name is Terry. And it was a really, really insightful 3 or 4 days with this bloke on how he operated his business. He was a business owner. He's got a little invention of a second business coming on the side with fascinating stuff. Really smart guy. He's got about 15 staff, and he really ruthlessly protects his time. He only works about 5, sometimes 6 hours a day, but his dynamic between kids and work and being able to find a balance in how he conducted his day was super interesting. Certainly being French, that appreciation around meals, that real value around family really came through. But he was running a $2 or $3 million or €2 or €3 million company every year. So it wasn't a small company. He was running and had a lot of demands on his plate. And his exact words were, "I'd much rather disappoint a customer than my family." When I was asking about where's this 5 hours come in from, how is that not expanded over time, right? All of us have an intention of working less, but it always starts to expand. And it was really a space of, he knows that he's saying no to deals. But it's coming back to the IKEA story, it's really that awareness of, well, do I want to grow this company to an absolute behemoth, or do I want to make sure that I'm growing enough to really build to what I want to optimize for, which is finding a balance between a vehicle that allows me to run the life I want to live while also having that family and health to make sure day-to-day is looking good. All right. Now, the third part here is something that most partners don't want you to hear. It's like, don't try to get to this ratio. But something that he does is he's an absolute 50-50 split between his work and his kids. All right, he knows he's important. He knows he's busy. He knows he's got all this stuff on. But for a lot of you, that's not them. It's an awareness of reminding yourself that you only get this time once with your kids. And his kids were incredibly enjoyable to spend time around. They were 4 and 6. They were very rarely on screens. They were incredibly self-regulated. When they tripped up and fell, they kind of got up, said ouch, and carried on. They were talking between each other. There was a really cool mix where he said that, when he went away on holiday or when he needed to go away on a work trip, as soon as he got back, he did everything he could to get that balance back in line, because he saw the difference in the distance between him and his kids. He saw the difference in how they interacted with each other. And it really just became a huge, for me, I appreciate that so much out of his redefinition of success, because nothing was immediate or reactive or stressed. And there was a couple of really big conversations that he had to have while we were there. And it was really very much just the permission to step back, give himself that space before he came back into the room and say, hey, I've just had a couple of things that need to come up. I'll see you in 5, but we're going to do this one later. And we're really, really going to block it out. So his calendar space, or certainly in the internal calendar space for him, was he had work blocked out and he had his kid time blocked out, and it was ruthlessly on the same level, right? And I think it's just one of those things that I bring it up not to make you feel bad about parenting, because I think you've got enough of that going on. I bring it up as an awareness towards it can be done, and it's simply a redefining of your own personal success and where that comes through, because your demands on your time, the expansion of your calendar, the next big project that comes through is something that you can actually build a muscle called no and find a balance of what projects you decide to take on, what clients you take on, what clients you remove, so that you find that balance of actually building a vehicle that's building the life you want. Because as you all know, if you don't block that calendar out for you, there's 10 other people that are quite happy to book it for you. And I think it just allows you, both from a relationship standpoint and from a personal health aspect, it's very much just that deep conversation around the uncomfortable stuff, which is your control of your own time. You've got very good at feeling safe when working, and you've got very unsafe when not working. You're not sure what to do with yourself. I am the absolute product of this. I needed 6 weeks on holiday because I needed 3 weeks to actually unwind to then finally enjoy the last 3 weeks. Like, it's a muscle to be built. And just being able to get back to that space and giving yourself permission to feel uncomfortable, or not pick up your phone every time you've got 2 seconds, and just sit in the discomfort, is a really, really important place. Certainly an observation of mine throughout, the inclination to wake up on 3 coffees and go to bed on 2 or 3 glasses of wine, and that cycle that repeats for so many people, is really just an external way to get energy and then block it out, and then get energy and block it out, rather than actually allow an internal self-regulation of what's going on. All right. So the last one I want to add in here, team, was really that space that we all get into, which is when you're stuck on a problem. The big thing that he always did was he made sure he went for a paddleboard. He spent time doing something else because he knew this was the best thinking he could do. And even if he didn't get the light bulb moment while he was away to fix a problem, he certainly came back with a much better view and perspective to be able to tackle that problem. And that in itself, I think, kind of tells you everything, which comes back down to how you regulate your state, your nervous system throughout the day. If you're in a heightened, rushed response, you're not going to sleep as well, which means you are literally dumber. You're not going to come to the day with the same amount of focus and energy throughout the day. Your digestive capacity drops because you're pulling all your blood towards your muscles in a stress state rather than actually allowing yourself to digest meals. And there's so many other things that are going to start coming through, right? Negative thoughts literally create that stress in the body that then leads to that systemic inflammation. So there's so many things tangibly, like, can I have my new superfood in today's lunch, rather than really addressing that state of mind and how we tackle the day. And I think it really comes back down to, hopefully, if this resonates with you as much as it did for me, is just that redefinition of success in its first instance, and our rush towards whatever that version means, right? Run your own race. Something I heard just yesterday is, if you win the rat race, you're still a rat. So really just looking at that overall understanding is, I thought, really helpful. Does that feel I'm heading on the right lines there, team? Little nod? Cool. All right. So the big one I'm trying to get across today, team, is very much just perspective. Many of us know what's important, but yet life pulls us into this reactivity without really knowing our values. It tickles that short-term desire of feeling important, but it doesn't really build out what we know is really living in our values overall. So as we started today, it's very much a space of just being able to zoom out, put perspective on what's important, and protect that with our life's purpose, right? Put less importance on the bonus, the project, the next client, and more purpose on that, or more emphasis, I guess, on the health, the purpose, the kids, the time we actually want to spend that around. So I'm going to bring this around to a question. I'll keep you all awake. Where do I find that I'm showing up a little bit too reactive? Am I missing moments of joy or gratitude? Am I creating more stress out of a situation than I need to? Probably yes, yes, and yes. So let's give us some answers on these 3. I'd love to get an answer really just the first one. Once you've written the full answer, give yourself a good 30-40 seconds on this, guys. Where is that coming out? Where could I possibly add more joy to my life? What am I making a little bit more stress out that I need to right now? And then once you've got that all summarized, what's the overall, what am I getting too reactive to? Answer that one last. Mick, the funny thing I found is while I was away on holiday, I was limited to 2 calls a week, which was a call with 2 different leadership teams. And I actually felt like things got done. And it was a real realization that the speed to my week is based on the speed of my reply to emails. So if I wanted to slow down my week, slow down the reply to your emails. Sam, that's really awesome. Yep. It's just the ability to give yourself permission to wind down at the end of the day. I really like the concept of, as soon as whatever's constant for you, if you work at home, this is something you need to be even more aware of. But if you work away from home, as soon as you get in the car, it's that 3 to 5 deep breaths. I move out of CEO mode and I move into dad mode, or whatever it might be, that space where you're able to really just, I need to put that other hat on. Because if you come in with that same energy as a CEO as you do as a father, it's probably not going to land the same way. I sometimes feel more comfortable at work because I can see tangible results and I know when I'm doing well. When I come home, there's so many variables. That's such a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly what you just said. Though I work from home, so I do need to work out sometimes how to have that space. So usually it's the 5 minutes on the way to daycare pickup
Yeah.
where I can chats, but sometimes it's not enough.
Yeah. I really, really like how you've worded that, and it's probably going to keep me spiraling all afternoon. But that concept of, in a lot of ways, if you're too triggered, you're so focused on the demands of the day, you'll nearly almost go find a way to pick a fight with your partner, so you've got something to win. Like there's got to be something to like tangibly tackle once your day's finished, right? And I think that's a space that so many people get into, is it doesn't have to be the next target. It's actually just permission to wind down. It's a muscle to be built. Yep, the 2 phones idea, great one.
Can I just say something? I've just only last night. It's the last couple of nights. So I'm getting to this habit now of turning the phone off at 5 p.m. and then
Yep,
at 5, like 7, 8, turn it back on again. So
yep.
I've just constantly created a habit thing happening at the moment. But I actually me and my wife had an argument yesterday because the roles are reversed now. So I'm actually having to go there when she's on the phone and the kids are trying to get her attention. So it's like, I'm like, well, you put your phone. Like the kids were talking to her yesterday and she's like doing something on the phone.
Yep.
Sure, the kids are trying to talk to you like, will you put? She's like, oh, sorry, I'm alright. And she's like, she cracked the shits at me because I'm the roles are reversed. She not me telling me to put the phone down.
Yeah.
So I felt like I had a bit of a good moment there. I felt proud of myself that I was actually dictating to her what she needs to do for the kids.
Yeah, yeah. And it is one of those things that you'll notice you go through ebbs and flows of this. Like nobody's perfect on this. It's simply an awareness and something that can always be improved. And you'll always notice when things aren't quite going as well as they need to at work, that's when you need to lean into that a space of how reactive you're showing up at home, right? When things are going well at work, it's all fine at home, right? But it's a space of how often those two overlap. And I think sometimes that awareness of, no, that we keep them separate, but your state of mind is always going to be part of that.
The funny thing is, I'm creating. I'm trying to like this last week. I'm trying to create better habits for myself now, like getting up at 4:30, doing my routines in the morning. I've actually started picking up on her habit. I've actually been watching her bad habits. I've noticed a lot more from her now, so I'm trying to tell her to stop stuff now. So like the roles have completely switched now, and I've actually started this like psychologically. I think it's affecting her because I'm picking more out on her every day now, which is quite funny.
I think the one thing I would mention there is hopefully through what you can do is offer a perspective. What you can't do is make someone change. So if it's a case of like, quietly at the end of the day, it's a space of like, you mentioned that you wanted to spend more time with your kids. I'd love to know when you're getting that in type thing. And I think the reason I bring that up is that it allows you to feel like you're a partnership. It allows you to feel like you're on the same wavelength. And I think as we came back to the point before, like people only change when they get to a point that they reach a threshold where they need to change. So yeah, awesome when you've gone that through yourself. Cool. I think I've got a lot of that switching off phones, I think is a big part of it, right? We're in a world where you can be messaged 10 different ways. And if you have all those bings and dings and pops go off on your phone, you're constantly, not to mention not unproductive, you're constantly pulled back into that world, and it only reinforces that more. I know myself to the point that if there is a notification on my phone, I'm that guy that just has to get rid of that red note. So my phone just never makes a noise. I just do not look at that. If I'm on my computer and my team know they can message me through Slack, that's the only thing that I'm going to respond to in that 2 or 3 hour period. Everything outside of that, I have an allocated time in my day to look at it. All right. And again, that's something that doesn't change. That may not be the space for you right now. Maybe there's certain jobs that need to be built out for today, and there's certain allocations of that for the morning and afternoon for you. But it's just finding a way of knowing yourself and human psychology as a whole, and then being able to create those little adjustments in your design of your day. Something I'm a huge fan of is focus less on trying to improve your personal willpower and focus more on your discipline of environment, right? Like if you're the guy that eats the cake don't have your cake sitting out on the bench, right? Like if you know that you're going to pick up the phone and reply to the 3 messages that just came through, turn off the notifications and create a time to go through it, right? Like that's a space that hugely is, I see as a big problem where we start to beat ourselves up because we think we need to be more disciplined, where the people that are consistent long term are actually just more disciplined in environment, right? There's food, the food in the fridge is easier to eat rather than the crisps that are out. Like when you just design your life in a way that is easier to follow through, it's human nature to choose the easiest path. And if you design healthy as an easier path than unhealthy, then you're in a great spot, right? For me to eat a healthy meal now, if I walk into the kitchen, is easier than to eat an unhealthy meal. And I think if you ask yourself that question, if I walk into the kitchen after this meeting, I probably haven't eaten for the last 4 hours, I'm going to go find something to eat. Is it easier to grab the chocolate bar and the chips that are in the pantry, or have you actually got a full meal ready for you in the fridge? Get to that point, right? Get to that design and you're in a place where things start to get a lot easier. Cool. So this really circles back to the concept that we've kind of touched on throughout the first couple of points here, right? The perspective to which we look at health first, and then to that reactivity to which we hit our day. The reason I'm pushing on that so much is very much that first instance, which is how our body regulates, how our body responds to the outside world. And depending on how you look right now, on how you're functioning on a day-to-day basis, is how your body responds to the outside world. Now, the reason I bring that up is we talk a ton about gut health. We talk a lot about really diving into understanding that balance of bacteria in your stomach and what foods make a difference and how that systemically has an impact on your body. But the one thing that most people in this space are really ignoring overall is that your body is constantly responding to the outside world. And I mentioned it before, which is when you're in a stressed out state, 80% of that blood in your body is pulled towards your limbs, your arms and your legs, right? It's that stressed out fight or flight response. Now, what you need to realize that there is when your blood is pulled towards your extremities, that means that it's pulled away from your digestive tract. So if you're in a state where you're stressed out and you're trying to eat your perfect salad, by not managing the state to which you're eating that meal, you've just drastically changed your ability to actually make the most of a high quality meal. All right. So we're going to look into this a little bit more, but just understanding that concept of the physical reaction to a psychological state, i.e. being stressed, being grumpy in traffic, being pissed off with your work colleague, with having that argument with your partner. It's all a physical response that changes your state, changes how your body is able to operate on a day-to-day basis, downregulates your immune system, downregulates your digestion, all of these things that are going to have an impact on how your body responds. And the really, really big reason I bring this up is that we focus so much on the probiotic, the acid reflux medication, the whatever we need to add to the body, and we don't really address our state to which we associate the world. I'm going to circle back to that last comment, but that awareness around digestion, I think this is one that we really emphasize with our clients a lot, is the one best thing you can do for digestion is simply taking 5 deep breaths before a meal, right? Just the amount of times I do that where I realize I'm just a little bit stressed, a little bit heightened, a little bit rushed, and I go into a meeting, into a meal, and I just go, okay, that was actually way higher than I thought it was, right? So just bringing yourself down and regulating that state before eating is the best thing you can do to improve digestion. It's not the probiotic, it's not the fancy kombucha, it's an awareness around your state to which the way you are eating, all right? So if there's one thing from today, if you're going to improve digestion, when we look at things like IBS, we look at issues in how you're digesting food, whether it's that gurgling stomach, whether you feel that food is just sitting there, whether there's loose stool someday and you don't know why that's happening, really just addressing your state around meals is a really great place to start. From there, we can certainly look at intolerances. Maybe there's a gluten intolerance or a certain nightshade or something there. But if we're not taking that time to bring awareness to how we're eating and where, we're kind of missing half the picture. All right. So that's the first one I want to bring up. So coming back to the gut health piece, team, this diagram I've used for a very long time simply because it's a nice simple diagram of what that gut really does. It's essentially the boundary or barrier to the outside world, much like the skin, right? Skin's our biggest organ in our body, but really for our gut, it's part of an overall system. It's not, how can I go here? Gut health is a system, it's not an organ. So that lining of our gut is ultimately the boundary to the outside world. So when we consume something, whether that be food, whether that be water, whatever, that ultimately does not become part of us until it's absorbed through that gut lining, right? The reason I bring that up is when we've bombarded our body over years and years with certain foods that maybe are subpar. Maybe it's a deep fried food and those vegetable oils. Maybe it's a certain intolerance or sensitivity to a particular category of food. It might be the dairy or whatever. If we do that over and over again, what happens is those little bodyguards that are supposed to be keeping out the bad guys start to really break down, start to get to a point where we're allowing a lot more of those toxins and outside sort of particles get into the bloodstream, and that's where that inflammation is really caused. So what we're looking at here is if you notice that you used to have a real bulletproof gut, and that's starting to become more and more of a problem as we get older. You're starting to notice that there's more foods that you don't feel as good on, or maybe you just feel constantly bloated and you're not sure why. Certainly on the female side, where hormonal shifts create a huge increase in histamine or a lack of histamine tolerance, this is something that we see happening a lot, where those intolerances go through the roof when we can't find the root cause of the certain food that's causing the issue. So when we look at that through our state and the ability to regulate our breathing and overall nervous system when eating, that has to be our first step. But when we address gut health and we address that space of what foods we are eating, that is always going to be the first space of being able to balance out these bacteria in our stomach and making sure our body is actually working on our side. It has to start with just paying attention. And I think there's a lot of tests that can be sold out there that are your food intolerance tests, etc. Those things can change every 2 or 3 months. The best thing you can use is how do you feel on certain foods and bringing attention to your state when eating. All right. So just want to bring that one up briefly. So the overall concept we're looking at here, guys, is there's a really great book called Your Body Keeps Score. And the concept overall, if we're going to summarize it, is that our bodies hold emotions and stress in a very physical level, right? This can lead to, obviously the increase in our blood pressure, the decrease in flexibility, that impaired digestion overall. We've really heavily focused on that digestion piece, but if you're noticing that you're stressed, anxious all the time, there's always a level of tightness or lack of flexibility that probably comes with that too, right? It's an inflammatory response as well. So the big one that if we keep this on track with this concept of optimizing to 80, we start to really, it wouldn't be a health journey unless we looked at our overall satisfaction of life and ultimately personal joy levels, right? We talked about this before. When we start looking at regulating our nervous system, being okay with not working and being able to sit in a space enjoying our kids or a movie or the sunrise or the sunset, whatever it might be, that's a huge part of really addressing that overall mental health, that overall well-being, because in a very real way, our body's going to hold that stress. If we're going to go a little bit deeper in this, guys, and please stop me if I'm going a little bit too technical, I've saved myself for the second part of today, but an awareness of where we started around this concept of urgency addiction, right? When things are so urgent, we're in a level of stress all day. The reason we start so much on this health category, this space of improving both sleep and energy being your first instance, when we see stress go up, we start to see an increase in inflammation in the body. In a short instance, i.e. 30 minutes, is not an issue. But if you're noticing that you're stressed and you can't manage that state and you're heightened throughout 6, 8, 10 hours of the day, that's creating a systemic stress throughout the body, right? What that does is there's a lot of chemical disruptions here, but we're going to break that, two simplified ones is your unregulated carotene pathway and your decrease in serotonin, melatonin. A lot of that is actually happening inside of the gut, and you're getting a lot of disruption of really reducing that serotonin. Serotonin, if you don't know, is one of those main sort of happy hormones, and 90% of it is actually produced in your stomach. This has a huge impact on sleep quality because serotonin is a precursor to melatonin, so you're not getting deep quality sleep. When we're not getting deep quality sleep, what's the one thing we do? If we don't get at least 6 hours of deep quality sleep, we're going to be eating at least 300 to 600 calories more to make up for that energy discrepancy throughout the day, right? So we start to make poor food choices. We start to try pick up on the stimulants, the sugars throughout the day to make up for that gap. That, of course, disrupts our gut even more, creates more leaky gut, creates more alterations in our good to bad bacteria in our stomach, which, of course, then increases inflammation in our body, lowers our tolerance of stress, and we start the cycle over and over again. All right. So the reason you saw this get quick really quickly, or get deep very quickly, but this awareness of the reason I started on urgency addiction, this awareness of our state and our ability to adjust how we operate on a day-to-day basis without changing anything food-wise is going to have an immense impact on how our body operates overall. All right. I can't take credit for this chart. This was our head nutritionist, Mandy, who just loves this stuff all day. But this awareness of this diagram of what's actually going on here and the circle that we start to see come through a lot. The big thing is, where do we start to break it? Where do we look at start to build into this? I think hopefully from today, that awareness of looking at your state around meals, your state around what success is for you individually, and what you're pulled into on a day-to-day level is really that first step. All right. So I did mention I was going to bring this up before, team. This is why I'm bringing it up. It's no longer fluffy. It's a very real part of making sure your body works well. What's 5 things that bring you joy, and what's one action we can do today to actually add joy into your life more often? Nadia, have you lost me? We're going well.
No, you're going really well. I was just thinking about what 5 things bring me joy.
Okay, awesome. The thinking face. Looks like a concerned face, but now I know.
What a hard question.
Yeah. Well, that in itself is the learning point, right? Like, you ask a 5-year-old what's 5 things that bring them joy, and they'll spout them off like it's the first thing they were thinking about. It's a muscle that's atrophied. I'd love to get the answer to this final question, team. Driving on the beach, playing golf, traveling somewhere new. I like it. Fresh air and ocean, kids, watching football. Meaningful work. I like that one, Sam. Playing with kids, experiences with family and friends. Smoking meats, time with my wife. Yep. Schedule time. And this is a very real part of, there's one bloke I'm working with at the moment, which is, a lot of gut issues coming through, wants to lose a bunch of body fat, all of these other things. And the one task I gave him who literally changed his entire perspective is, he was running a pretty big company. There was 400 plus staff under his management. And the first thing we started with was, let's block out something for you on a Wednesday or Thursday where you actually feel joy. And he's like, this is so fluffy. But a couple of weeks later, he felt like he was starting to self-regulate stress a little bit better. There was less alcohol consumption. There was less caffeine consumption. There was a less disrupted sleep routine, right? It really does make a difference when we start to build the muscle back. Cool. I really like these guys. Well done. Cool. So I'm going to manage time here a little bit. As I said, this is the first time I've gone through this, and I want to make sure that you've got some time for questions and things at the end. But the big part that I'm really trying to emphasize for you here is we want to get the order right, and the body starts working with you rather than against you, right? We're not just slogging ourselves in the gym and dropping the calories through the floor. We're actually looking at making sure things are self-regulated, they're operating well at a cellular level, things are actually healthy, and then we can start to really build from here. So the big one I'm going to look at overall, and Sarah knows I've done a full training on this before. I could talk about this one chart for like the whole day. But the big one we're addressing is before we look at nutrition and training, and of course that's going to be part of the picture. But what we're addressing so far is we're addressing the nervous system and how we operate or we respond to the outside world. We're looking at addressing toxicity, which only gets worse when our gut wall is broken down, which of course comes back to that stress again, or at least our ability to regulate around meals. And then that in turn is going to have a huge impact on sleep. We've done a lot of trainings on sleep, where you wake up in the night and what that means around what you need to adjust tells you a lot, right? Like, if you wake up 2 hours into the night, it's a different problem than if you wake up 5 hours into the night. And a big part of this comes down to getting things to operate better, because you can't sleep harder. You have to address what's happening during the day. So looking at those 3, building those 3 as front-loading health is what we're talking about today, and trying to make sure that we get those in the right spot. So the last thing I'm going to finish on today, team, and then I want to make sure we've got enough time for questions overall. One of you mentioned this before around the marathon running, and this guy's an inspiration of mine. He owns the company Zero Shoes, brilliant company when it comes to more barefoot style running. They're not the most sexy shoes in the world, but they're incredibly comfortable, and they're very helpful for an awareness around how you walk, how you run, how you weight train. I don't train in anything other than flat shoes now, and I think it'll be a $1 billion company in the next 3 to 5 years. He's doing really, really good stuff. But the thing that really inspires me above all is that he's still sprinting at 61. He's at a place where he's very much the pinnacle of, I'm not trying to get better than last year. I'm just incredibly stubborn to not go backwards, and I'm going to hold on to it for as long as possible. And there's this little group of 6 to 10 people that are sprinting against each other every year. They're more competitive than ever, and they're doing everything possible to beat the guy next to them. That's a really cool space to get to. And I think the reason I bring this up overall is one of the things that gets in the way, I think, the most is that we're all trying to get back to the 25-year-old version of us rather than working towards the best 80-year-old version of us. And if we just shifted that, we'd be in less of a rush, we'd enjoy the process more, and we'd actually see the bigger picture. So I think the big one there is just, find that purpose, find that reason, that first question we asked you at the very start of today, what does 80 look like? And then we can really start to look at optimizing towards what are the exercises, the foods, the routines that we can start to install in our day that allows us to get closer to that. All right. So that's just the overall picture. And I think this question I'm going to come back to in a second, or just maybe think about it while I talk, is one of the things that I've seen with the success with some of our top clients at the moment is that they have a benchmark activity that they do with their mates once a year or every couple of months with their girlfriends or whatever it might be, where it allows it to be that benchmark, where they're able to set a little bit of an assessment of where they are compared to last year, right? One of my guys at the moment, it's the mountain biking, the annual mountain bike where everybody's absolutely shagged at the end, but they at least got to beat the person next to them, right? It's just that benchmark, whether it's a squash game, it's the mountain biking, it's it could even be the fishing trip, like whatever it is where you notice a level of energy, stamina, competition, whatever it might be, to be your benchmark to keep you young for as long as possible. A huge part of this comes back to companionship, having people that you do these things with, that joy bucket, all of that's important as well. But I think that benchmark activity, what do you want to still be doing in 20 years, or what keeps you young? For this Stephen, the zero bloke, it's the sprinting, right? Which of all the activities you think you'd be doing at 61, it was not the first one that comes to my list, but it keeps him young. Yeah, playing footy with the kids, that's a goodie. Maybe competition, but not exactly. Maybe there's probably an Aussie version of this I'm not aware of. So I'm going to bring up one last point. Hopefully this isn't completely left field, but hopefully it does allow you to look at this through something tangible, something a little bit more actionable today. And I couldn't finish today without at least installing some of the exercise part, which is the top 3 signs of longevity overall, team. If you want to be strong, stable, and healthy at 80, is going to be your grip strength, it's going to be walking speed, and it's going to be muscle mass. They're the 3 most correlated ones, and really are all markers of your strength, your balance, and your fitness. So the whole goal of this perspective shift is we start to create associations around how today's tasks allow you to move forward to what those look like. Now, the first one with the grip strength, the one I really like to do, and I think is a fantastic activity overall, and we've got 45, 55-year-old women that have never touched a barbell in their life getting to a point where they're doing their first pull-up. I think it's really, really cool. But the first thing that always is highlighted is the weakness of a pull-up is grip strength, right? So just getting to a point where you're holding a bar and hanging for a bar for 30 seconds, doing a couple rounds of that. Amazing for your shoulders, amazing for your core, and really, really good for your grip strength, all right? So it doesn't even have to be a pull-up. It could simply be a dead hang. The second one is pay attention to walking speed. One thing that comes through is, make it a bit more of a fast-paced walk, but what are the muscles that you're using throughout a walk? One of the things that 99% of our clients we emphasize through the first couple months of training is glutes, right? Getting your glutes working again. We're very quad dominant as a society. We're always sitting on our bum or not getting our hips through a huge amount of range. So spending more time on your glutes, massive impact on your mobility and your walking speed overall. The next one here is hitting your protein targets. We go as high, or quite commonly, we push towards 2 grams per kilo of body weight, up to about 100 kilos, and then we start to balance out a little bit depending on lean muscle mass, but an awareness of actually hitting a good protein amount. If we look at 2 grams per kilo of body weight, that's probably currently double what you're currently eating. That'll highlight something for you, all right? Maintaining muscle mass. I have gone through an unfortunate observation of this with both my grandparents and my wife's grandparents. That's still weird to say, by the way, a week later, they went through that period of declining health really quickly. And the first thing I noticed was, man, those legs got skinny really quickly, right? So being able to maintain muscle mass for as long as possible is something I'm sure you've seen in close ones next to you, and something you should be really building for you directly, all right? And then the last one, which I'm just going to put in for Nadia so she keeps working for you guys, is keep the mind sharp, keep working. The more you keep your brain tackling those big, chunky problems, the more that brain stays sharp long term. All right, so just want to add it in there. Cool. So the whole reason I bring that up, team, is just, the more ways we make these real, the more we make them associations to what this looks like, I think the more reason you have behind doing them every day, and it just creates that low burning drive every day rather than it need to be a new exciting new red button. And I think when you've got that in place, that motivation shifts, the reason to why you do it shifts, and hopefully that perspective stays with what this actually looks like. Even with the new exciting things that are happening at work, you are finding a way to fit you back in. All right, so that's all I've got to say. The final note really here is we all feel like we're too busy to work out, yet hopefully today it's highlighted that it's a one thing that might actually be giving you more years to do the things you enjoy. So in that light, it becomes your most important activity.